Hi, Steve Patterson back. I just finished live a few minutes ago. But one thing I had intended to do that I didn't do, that I said I was going to do, was to talk a little bit about shadow work, because tomorrow is shadow work with a conversation with Carrie Slayton. And last week we touched on shadow a couple of times. And so what today, since I already spoke of the scientific approach to consciousness, since I've already done that with consciousness, I wanted to talk a little about now real fast, because I said I would, shadow. And so before I do that, I see a couple of people are getting here, probably wondering why I just came back on live again. I'll briefly recap. I realized that I had forgotten to mention anything about shadow that I said earlier today on Facebook that I would. And I did want to do that because we talked a little bit about shadow type work in the past couple of lives. And also tomorrow, that's the actual title, and that's what we're going to be talking exclusively about. But before we did that, since Carrie will be talking about all of the ways of shadow work as it's done in the ways that most people think about it, I would guess, in other words, not in a clinical setting with a psychiatrist, that I wanted to touch a little bit about their take on it briefly beforehand, so that A, I don't have to do it in it, and two, because I know that these kinds of spaces aren't as comfortable for those who tend to lean more on the esoteric spiritual side. So basically, one thing that we have to start with is Carl Jung, right? He's the one that brought shadow into the forefront as an accepted thing. There was people before him that referred to the space, but he was one that put that on there with his archetypes. And so also a question was asked about archetypes in response to the earlier live that I'm going to address here in a second when I talk specifically about the way that the clinical nature of this goes, because he is or was a psychiatrist, right? He was definitely in that sense a scientist working in, vetted, organized, licensed medicine, however you want to say that, which is a scientific field. We just don't think of it. We tend to think of microscopes when we think of scientists. And so anyway, so when you take Jung, however you want to say it, I've heard lots of people say it, maybe it's their accent, with shadow, what took place after that was, of course, with anything, once a new idea comes along, once something really takes hold, like happened with his work, it's used. And of course, it was ferreted out the rest of the way in psychotherapy, and it was ferreted out by people who didn't have psychotherapy maybe as part of what they did. And so on the clinical side, what it became really is what you could say today, any kind of, what on the spiritual side we might say of digging deep, looking for the thing in the subconscious that's causing some kind of disruption to the now. Something that took place then that is still impacting you now, but maybe you don't see because it's in the shadow, aka subconscious, vis-a-vis memories that are formed, memories that are objective perhaps in their visual presentation, but over time, the context of these things becomes convoluted, maybe they come apart, just all these kinds of ways that they look at the way that experience becomes fragmented over time, and parts of it come back or attach themselves to other areas. And so you can see in the words I use there that you see a lot of the whole thing of digging deep. You see attachment there, because you see also during psychotherapy, they start to have neuroscience come along and all these things. And so they're mapping it much the way that I said in the first, the scientific approach to consciousness that I talked about on live just a few minutes ago. So that's what's going on in psychotherapy. And that's why you then have a completely different view of the subconscious world, and what on the one side is referred to as the shadow, on one side could be the subconscious. And so from the subconscious scientific point of view, you have psychotherapy. And so basically, when we talk about shadow work, and I'm generally speaking of the kind that pertains to seeing into a dark space, that has something to do with a previous, that has something to do that is a part of us we don't see, all these kinds of feels. That effectively is the subconscious in the in the scientific side, the organized medicine, psychotherapy. If you go to a psychiatrist or a social worker or a counselor, technically speaking, they have different degrees of how much they adhere to the models that science produces for them, and it leaves a lot of gray areas because of consciousness itself being difficult to explain, like I talked about in the other one. So where you see this manifest is things like, okay, in physical doctors, we might be able to see that by setting a broken bone this way, it will heal relatively free of further concern, other than maybe some tissue or some scar buildup or calcium or whatever it might be. But other than that, it'll functionally be there, and you shouldn't have any noticeable impact on your day-to-day life. But when it comes to the medicine of the mind, it's not like that. You can't literally take two and call me in the morning and hope for some kind of guarantee. Whereas if you do take this antibiotic, say, for 14 days, yeah, you probably get rid of that virus. And we could talk about the merits of how that happens all we want, but effectively that's what happens with medicine. It's demonstrable. That's why they have to have trials on things. You don't have it like that in psychotherapy. What you have there is what they call what was the word they used? Best evidence-based research. So evidence-based means that when you have, say, a new notion, like say I come up with, I'll use an example. I was about to use an example that hasn't been accepted, but I'll use the example anyway. Smart recovery, something that I got into when I was doing recovery work with people that had stopped using, but were in the transition point between freedom of all of it and dealing with the path, how they were going to handle the recovery path. And so I was there with them on that. And so in that space, though, the dominant system was AA for the longest time. But AA is limiting in that it keeps the person in the alcoholic mindset. And I'm not trying to throw it under the bus, but generally speaking, by identifying with yourself as an alcoholic, when you stand up day after day, week after year after whatever, decades for some after decade, that you're still suffering from the container or the limitation of the addiction, however you want to describe it, whether it's physiological or whatever, but you're so enamored, you could say, with that energy that it's still present with you. How have you really changed? Has it caused the same kind of drag on your life as the other thing did in the first place? And I'm not trying to throw it on the bus, but you can see why that's there. And also there's steps, there's, all these things. So for some people, they don't like that linear model like that. And for some, it's maybe they don't want to be as accountable as you have to be on some. I'll give full credit where it's due. Those are some tough things to do. Some of them maybe have some more power than others. Some of them, I believe, though, don't at all, and they work in the opposite direction. And so that's why I was attracted to alternatives to AA, such as Smart Recovery, the secular ones like LifeRing, the one that came out of the Native American tradition, the well-being movement, Wellbriety, and things like that. But Smart Recovery I brought to Athens, Georgia in the hopes they would catch on. Never did. But, now I guess it does in a couple places. I started, there's maybe still there, I don't know. But by and large, it hasn't, because it can't be evidence-based. Because you can't show that just because, the vast majority of people routinely go to a Smart Recovery meeting where they sit around and talk about how to approach problems and not the awful, that if they still maintain sobriety and a happy life, that it's not successful. It's not like the medicine you can give them. You can tell after 14 weeks of taking this thing if you've cleared yourself of whatever this ailment is, or if you've got the stitches for that many days, that it's time for them to come out. 9 out of 10 times, it's just fine. Anything else, it'd be understandable. They'd be able to tell you it was an infection, it was this, that, the other thing. They would know. It's not the case with psychotherapy. So when you have the limitation of evidence-based, if you keep yourself just evidence-based, you wind up with shadow work that then tends to not acknowledge as much in the way of esoteric things such as spirit, such as being connected with the universe, since science can't even understand that foundationally, beyond foundationally, like I talked about. So it stylizes it into a way to where it becomes the problem of the person, or that they're not owning up to something in some other way that they then try to explain with a best case scenario after it happens a certain amount of times and it shows a certain result. It's evidence-based. So in other words, we can't prove it, but our evidence shows that it does. But yet they will not share the same calibration of worth with approaches that come from the outside. Now, we do have some of that. We have the mindfulness movement, which did come originally out of, you could say, more of the meditation world and things of that nature, that now, generally speaking, is accepted, but it still would play second fiddle to something like the power of saying you need to go to AA if you get a DUI. You walk into a lot of places, and yes, I do have experience working in these places, and I'm not jaded by them. I understand where they're coming from. It's their careers. That's what they went to college to do. They're doing their jobs wonderfully, and they're great people. Nothing against them. But the problem that presents itself is for those who don't like the linear progression of steps, or who maybe don't even really need to see a counselor to talk about drugs and alcohol at all, ever, and just because they're not talking about it doesn't mean they're bearing it. So shadow work gets sort of lost in the mix over there. And it becomes various forms of psychotherapy that are either none of them are demonstrable like regular science. Like, science, the way they do the scientific method is you prove why it can't be true. So if you have a theory that you believe is true, you have to prove all the scenarios, and if one of them turns out to be the case, then you're done. In other words, this is what I think it is, and you think of all the various parts of it, and no, that wouldn't be there. Well, then your end thing can't be either. Sort of a backwards approach of looking at it, and I might not have done a very good job of explaining that, but you can't do it with psychotherapy. You can do it with other things. If we put this medication in them, it's not that will it help them, it's will it kill them. That's why they go through clinical trials for both. So within that, psychotherapy becomes very limited when it comes to shadow work, and that's where the beauty of the more esoteric approaches. And there's so many of them. Just the word itself, you might not find very many that even agree on that do it, that see it the exact same way, as opposed to everybody's going to know what cognitive behavioral therapy is. Everybody's going to know what a process group is, and they know exactly what they mean by that. Over here, it's a little different because it's personalized and it's comfortable. And to me, it's more expansive if it can contain necessary elements of actual stepping up to the plate and addressing whatever it is. No matter how you go into whatever kind of healing you go into, you are the determining factor. The things that happen around you are going to help or hurt. And I don't mean that in physical pain. Maybe so. In every instant, we have the choice to do. And it's easy to say that we have constraints on us. And, even if you're literally locked up in a house and you cannot leave, you have the option of dealing with that however you like. And that's where it just comes down to a matter of being able to dig down enough in you and finding a way to be able to do that, to making your circumstance just the way it's maybe not supposed to be, but the way that it is, and that, it just is, and that everything up to this moment led to it, and I have an option in doing with it what I can now. If I can't do anything about it, do I need to put my state in angst over that? Now, granted, there could be times of physical pain, and certainly there's going to be times when it's very hard, when there's love lost, lives lost, things like that. But I've said before, even the most miserable person on the earth right now, and it's weird to even think that there is that person, that you could even calibrate that. But that person would be somewhere right now. But even them, if they completely accepted life and removed all subjectivity from the fact that they're alive, and that sounds maybe too simple or too mystical, but it's a space that can be reached. That's the little point that we're talking about in that conscious piece that starts all this in the first place, that has conscious experience in this physicality, in this world that we create. That's as close to truth as you can get. And that's why I mentioned on Facebook, one thing that Hawkins pointed out in one of his lectures before he died was that when he calibrated people, he did all kinds of things: documents, people, their words. He calibrated 3 people ever to be the highest, and they were Jesus, Krishna, and Buddha. And then he says after that, the only 3 humans that ever walked the earth to be deserving of the title Lord. That's saying something, especially since Einstein was like 406, and they're 1,000. Wow, got some ground to cover there. E equals MC a lot more. But, I forgot what got me to that spot, but I'm just saying, when you get down to the simplest truths, the foundational places like that, it's easy to get lost because you lose all subjectivity. You lose all why. And it's not why like you're giving up. It's almost why as in why ask? Of course. What else would it be right now? When will it ever be tomorrow? It won't. When will it ever be anything but right now? It always is. There's no forward or backward or any of that. Okay, I'm getting too far, but you know how I talk about these things, and that's where I come from on this. That we are literally able to choose the entire lattice of options in our life. And if we flip all the switches in just the right way, if we can figure out how to do that, we can be at peace in the most dire circumstance. And we could still be treating it as serious as it is. But it doesn't change us all the way. So anyway, shadow work tomorrow with Carrie. I've known Carrie for a long time. She does a lot of different kinds of things, all working with people. And shadow work's been the dominant thing over the years. So she'll be on tomorrow. Check the events page. It's on my personal page. It's going to be on my personal page. It's the last one on the personal page. So that's something after that. Wednesday with the music one, that'll be here. But, so there's 2 lives. Sorry to drag you back in here again, but that's all I got. Have a good day.